Excellent. Right. So thank you very much for everybody coming in tonight. I'm hoping it's going to be very informative for you all. The goal really is to give you an insight into why checklists work, rather than just saying, here's a checklist, make it work. There are reasons behind that. And I'm going to talk about some of the aspects. So I'm going to talk for about 60 minutes or so, and then we've got until until 8 o'clock UK time. So another 30 minutes for Q&A. I'm going to go through some housekeeping to help manage that Q&A process, and also asking questions as we go through the session from that point of view. So start off with, I'm going to share my screen. There we go. Can you give me permission to share, B? If not, you're going to have to make me host again. And then
just a sec. You should be able to now.
Yeah, we can't make it co-host, John, because I hadn't set up co-hosts in my own space. So that you should have the opening slide. I can see Jason on my screen, so thumbs up if you can see the opening slide. Brilliant. Okay, so got 60 minutes of talking, and then about 30 minutes of Q&A at the end. So what we're going to talk about tonight, or what I'm going to talk about, and wait for questions to come through from yourselves. Bit of a background to me. I'm going to look at the purpose of checklists, and it's really important to understand why we put checklists in place. I'm going to talk about all sorts of diving, but as you come to realize as we go through this, that the more risky the dives, the more important that checklists become, because we have potential critical failure issues that we need to capture before we end up with something going horribly wrong. I'm going to talk about a little bit about the history of checklist design, where they come from, and then actually what appears to be a bit of a daft question is, what is a checklist? And that, I think, causes one of the problems we have in diving, is because the perception of what a checklist is to one person is different to another. We don't have a common language. And as a consequence, we end up with all sorts of heated arguments as to what is a good checklist or what isn't a good checklist. I'm going to talk about the operational environment, using them, then some of the design aspects, then looking at the limitations of checklists and what makes it hard to use them, and also when checklists don't work. And then we'll sort of summarize with some key points that go on, and then we'll move into the Q&A session. So next bit, so housekeeping. Everybody's on mute. B is hosting. I've got Guy and Bart are going to basically be question masters. So if you've got a question, please start it with Q:, and then whatever your question is. If it's really urgent and it needs to be asked then, Guy or Bart will interrupt me and we'll cover it then. Otherwise, we'll go through those questions when we come to the Q&A session, because we've got a lot of people. We've got 148 extra people in here. So there is potential for quite a lot. I'm not bothered whether or not you have your cameras on or off. I can only see 5 of you. So that's a limit from there. Got the Q&A, and then tomorrow you'll get an email with a link to the recording for this, so you can review stuff. And I'll also make the slides available if that question was going to come up as well. And actually, as a wider piece, for anything that I put out there in terms of the materials and things, feel free to use in your own courses, materials, or anything else like that. Just please put a little credit to Gareth Lockett, the Human Diver. That's all I ask. I stand on the shoulders of giants that are out there. All I've done is just translated it from aviation, healthcare, oil and gas, the research into the diving community to make it accessible. So there's very little of what I do is new or novel. And I remember hearing a quote that said that at the moment there is very little new research. You just haven't done an effective literature review to go and find the stuff that's already been out there. So my background, I spent 25.5 years in the Royal Air Force as a flight instructor and a flight commander on a squadron, was on Hercules transport aircraft. I then went into, did a systems engineering master's degree, then worked in trials, flight trials, research and development with our equivalent of DARPA, a company called DSTL, or an organization called DSTL. And then my last 5 years in the Air Force was as a requirements manager. So I looked at systems engineering and looked at procuring capabilities to stop helicopters and large transport aircraft getting shot down in operational theaters. So getting a real good idea of how systems operate and the interdependence of all of the links that go there. Now in 98, I certified as 99 certified as an open water diver, and then did nothing until 2005, where I got back into diving and went, I really like this. And it was where I was getting more interested in human factors and crew resource management, and realized that there was a huge gap in the diving knowledge, especially in the formal structured training programs looking at human factors. So in terms of diving, I'm a GUE Tech 2 diver, so advanced trimix, 72 meter certification, and certified on JJ Mod 1 to 45 meters. Haven't done much rebreather diving for the last 4 or 5 years, just because I've been busy doing everything else. I sold my unit, but I'm retaking a class at the end of May with Graham, who I think is on board here. So in 2016, I formed the Human Diver, and I started delivering training in human factors and non-technical skills, the bits that make technical skills work. So technical skills would be buoyancy, propulsion, trim, putting up an SMB, operating a rebreather. Non-technical skills is decision-making, situation awareness, communication, teamwork, leadership, followership, performance shaping factors, all of the bits that the glue that makes stuff work. And since then, I've trained more than 350 people face-to-face in classes, about 400 people in online classes, webinar-based classes, and more than 1,000 with the online microclass that I've done. 2019, I published Under Pressure, which has sold more than 4,000 copies now across the globe, which is brilliant. I'm gobsmacked that that has gone so far. And then in 2020, I released a documentary called If Only, which covers the tragic accident of a guy called Brian Buggy, who died whilst diving a rebreather on his final dive for his sports trimix class. The equivalent of it was a shallow trimix class, and unfortunately the oxygen was turned off on his cylinder and he went hypoxic on the surface and drowned, and his body was recovered. And I had the privilege to work with the widow, Ashley, and the dive team to put the documentary together. And there's a little extract from the video as we go through the presentation. And over the last 18 months, I've led 2 reviews into military diving fatalities, one open circuit and one closed circuit, and looking at the human factors events in that. And as to be expected, if you followed anything that I've written, the act of failure, the thing that you think is the obvious failure, that was just a huge collection. That was the tip of the iceberg of a huge collection of things, that not just this thing about the incident pit, but much wider than that. So what we're going to talk about is, to start with, what is the purpose of a checklist? And to me, the key one is reduce the impact of error. And I'm going to talk about these topics in more detail as I go through. So we're going to look at error, then we're going to look at something called critical steps, and we're going to identify what those are, and we stop them from being missed. Next bit is intentionally slowing our brains down. I've heard this phrase of, oh, I don't like using checklists because it slows me down. Yes, that is the purpose. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Going to reduce drift and normalization of deviance. Those 4 topics ahead, above there, or that are on the screen there, we all have them. We all make mistakes. We all miss those critical steps. We all want to go quickly, and we all drift. And when we come on to the next but one slide, or in fact the next slide, I'll talk more about that. My view, this is not what checklists are about. Unfortunately, they are used in all sorts of industries, not just the diving industry, as a liability limiting or a liability transfer tool. You didn't do the checklist, therefore it's your fault. Now, as we go through this, you realize that sometimes it's really hard to do a checklist, and there is so much friction, so much problem, so many problems doing it, that actually we just skip through. If we reward people for checklist completion, but not checklist compliance, we will get completed checklists. And the National Health Service in the UK have found that, where they've punished health workers for non-completion of the safe surgical checklist. So all that happens is they go tick, 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 there you go. But they haven't done the actions associated with that. So the top 4 is what I'm going to focus on. The bottom one is where the organizations try to limit their risk. So moving into what is human error. We got this classification, comes from a guy called Professor James Reason, and he talked about 2 buckets of information. First off, we've got errors, which are made up of slips. So I didn't intend to do something. And that might be that I didn't intend to cross clip a bolt snap on a D-ring, or I didn't intend to press the up, the inflate rather than the deflate. So it's something that I didn't intend to do. Now, lack of memory, or I've forgotten to do something. That could be, something you relate to is you walk out the door and you hear the door click behind you and you realize that your keys are inside the house. You're now locked outside. It could be about not putting scrubber into your scrubber material into the canister. It might be not analyzing your gas. It's something that you've forgotten to do, and there won't be a trigger to remember unless there is something external to your thought processes, be that a checklist or somebody else going, what about so-and-so? Mistakes, doing the wrong thing, but thinking it's right. So actually, I think that I'm preparing my rebreather or my dive gear the correct way, but actually I'm doing it wrong. And again, this is something that I don't know that I'm doing it wrong, because I've, in my brain, I've got a mental model that this is how stuff should be done. Those what we consider honest mistakes, and they are mistakes of omission. We have omitted to do something, and we're quite forgiving of people who've omitted to do something, as long as things aren't too severe. Then we move into violations, and this is emotional, because there's rules associated. So an unintended violation, I believe that I'm following the rules. There's not much difference between a mistake and an unintended violation, in that the rules, or the difference is having some rules in place. If everybody is breaking the rules, it's very difficult to do the normal thing, to do the good thing, because we're social creatures. And so it's easier socially to break the rule than it is to comply. And that could be following checklists. It might be that actually you can't do your job if you follow the rules. And that might be the dive center manager said, right, you've got to take those extra 2 people on that class, even though it violates the rules. And the manager says, well, there's other people there who will work for me as an instructor. You either take those people or I'll fire you. And it's not quite as direct as that, but the intimation is there. So these 3 give us opportunities for learning when we understand why the rules are broken. And this is what people normally think about violations. They're reckless, where we've got no thought or care for the consequence. But I don't know anybody who gets up in the morning and says, today's a great day to die, to get bent, to kill somebody, to damage something. So these bits here are very few and far between. And to a certain extent, checklists are probably not going to help you here. So checklists help in all of these situations, ultimately trying to stop us making a bad outcome. Now, importantly, human error is normal. You are never going to get away from making a mistake or forgetting something. What we can do, though, is we can trap it. Now, when we make errors and there's no critical outcome, it doesn't really matter. But when we've got something called critical steps, where, and this comes from the high-risk industries, the nuclear industry, define it as a human action that will trigger immediate, irreversible, and intolerable harm to an asset, and that could be a person, could be information, it could be some equipment, or if the preceding action is not performed, is performed improperly. Now, you could talk about a base jumper. The critical step, there are a number here. One is making sure the parachute's packed properly. And the next bit is, once that person's stepped off and gravity has taken over, there is no scrambling back and going, oh, I'm going to get back to there. That critical step has happened. And if you haven't done something beforehand, you're just going to go splat. It's not going to go well. And this, unfortunately, is what happened in the documentary, If Only. And I'd recommend, if you haven't seen it, that you go and watch it. And it tells the story, basically, the oxygen was not on when Brian stepped off the back of the boat. And that wasn't the first time that that had happened in terms of his own checklist following. So checklists, in their pure sense, are about trapping human error before you cross a critical step, before you get to a point that goes, if I haven't captured this, I'm literally dead, or I will be very quickly. And so that drives what the checklists should be about. Now, I have a question here for you, and B, you'll need to put a poll up, and the title is John's Reliability. So if John is 99% reliable, over 100 of the exactly the same tasks, how reliable is John? And B should put up a poll in a sec with some options, and I'd like you to tick the box. How's it going, B?
Actually, there are already some questions in the poll here.
Yeah, so there's a second poll. So there are 3 polls there. One was the diving one, which I haven't passed on. The next poll number 2. There we go.
Can I launch it?
Yeah, launch the poll and everybody tick, and you'll have, I'm going to give you 20 seconds to put your answers in. Got 10 seconds. 5, 3, 2, 1. Okay, show the results then, B. Aha. Actually, the answer is 37%. Because what we're doing is we've got compound decisions. And this is one of the problems we have, is that we think that we are going to be more reliable than we actually are. And this is one of the reasons why in high-risk industries, they recognize this human performance and the way that we make those mistakes. So if we look at in fact, if we close that, what you've also just demonstrated is system 1 behavior. System 1 behavior is this fast, intuitive, almost no thought processes involved at all. That's how we spend 90% of our time. We're operating in fast mode. System 2 is the logical thought process. We don't like sitting in system 2 because it consumes mental energy, and we are efficient creatures. We'd like to be as efficient as we can all the time. And this really is why checklists are there. What we're trying to do is move us from this fast thinking of everything is okay, where we're using lots of cognitive biases, we're pattern matching, we're almost making intelligent guesses, educated guesses based on previous experiences. But that doesn't necessarily help us when we're in critical situations. So that's the one of the bits is to slow us down. And what we also struggle with is something called outcome bias. So a number of you may have come across this term normalization of deviance before. And this is where we start with a set of standards and then we start to drift because nothing went wrong. We've changed our processes, our procedures, our actions, and we've drifted away from our training, but we're still doing, we're still safe. We haven't had a bad outcome. And what we do is we now set a new baseline. And then that stays the same for a while, and then we start to drift. And then we start to drift. And then we start to drift. And then we have an accident. And people go, how on earth could you have drifted from the rules over here to your operating state here? Because that's a huge delta between this. But actually, what we're doing as we're going along is we're taking little delta changes. And this concept of normalization and deviance came from the launch, it's called a book called The Launch Decision, about the Challenger loss by Diane Vaughan. And she looked at it at an organizational level. It also applies at individual levels. And we have a set of standards. This is what this green line is. And this is what we would consider safe. And we stitch this line. We have this, what I call scary moment. I might swear. That's not right. And then we go back to the rules that we're supposed to be following. So we continually stitch this line. And as long as nothing goes wrong, everything's okay. The problem is we need these safe, scary moments every now and again, because otherwise what happens is we drift a long way. And we get to somewhere that's called the marginal boundary in the safety research bit, where it's sort of close. It's a risky area, but we don't know where the failure point is. So what happens is we just now set this as our new baseline. And we never know what the thing is that's going to take us over the edge. If we have checklists in place, that allows us to stay closer to the rules because we're using a tool to keep us accountable. So this is the next question, B, on the poll. Who has trapped an error? Who's caught an error through checklists? And the poll will come up in a sec now. I'm just interested in whether or not you've caught gas being turned off, the gas wasn't analyzed. It might be that your rebreather wasn't set up properly. All of those sorts of things that a checklist would trap. And launch the poll when you're ready. And what I'm looking at is a written checklist or a verbally prompted checklist. And we'll talk about those in a sec. And I'll give you another 10 seconds for that. Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Show the results. Excellent. Okay, that's good. Now, this is, a rough thing. We're going to talk about, some research out there that shows the value of checklists. And the most difficult bit is you don't use a checklist, something doesn't go wrong, and therefore you think it's okay. So it can be a real challenge to get the importance of checklists across, especially when it says that, or appears to say that you're incompetent or you're having to use a checklist because you're not very good. Now, in aviation, this started between the wars, where the Boeing Model 299 was being flown. It was a trial aircraft, and they had the chief test pilot and the chief flight test engineer from the US Army Air Forces, and they were flying this aircraft and another one in a competition. And unfortunately, Hill and his crew with 4 others got in the aircraft, and unfortunately, they didn't unlock one of the locking mechanisms, and they got airborne and stalled the aircraft. And Hill and the flight test engineer were killed, and the 3 analysts down the back survived. And that aircraft lost the competition because they sat there and went, God, there's no way we can operate this. But the immediate response from the US Army Air Forces was, I know, let's give them more training because that's what we need to do. And you sit there and go, hang on a minute, this was your chief flight test, chief test pilot and chief flight test engineer. How much experience had they got to be able to fly this aircraft? We're never going to be able to train our co-pilots to that sort of level. So we're going to really struggle. And then what they did is they broke it down into the little steps to say, right, what are the chunks that need to be done? And treating them as discrete steps that had to be exercised. And so what they started to do is put little sort of 4x6 postcards, and they write out before start checks, engine start, pre-taxi, pre-takeoff, after takeoff. And these then became more formalized when they worked out what needed to be done in the best way. And these were the killer items. There were a whole bunch of other stuff that went there through their training, but these were the bits that had to be done. And as an example, for landing a 747, there are 4 items in the pre-landing checks, which is flaps, speed brake, gear, and cabin announcement. And that's it. And you sit there going, really? That's all? That's it. Now, there's a whole bunch of other stuff. The pilots are doing their uppy, downy, lefty, righty stuff, and they're making sure that the aircraft's flying. But in terms of the killer items to land the aircraft, 4 items, that's it. Now, another bit that came out of the war, Second World War, is designing the cockpit so that it was easy to use. And there are a number of cases where pilots were raising the landing gear instead of the flaps, and the gear would collapse on the runway, and then they'd black the runway, so they couldn't use it. And again, it was more training. It's like, no, hang on a minute, we need to redesign the cockpit. And what they did is they just moved one of the levers to another part of the cockpit so that they couldn't make the mistake, because they were coming in scared from night bombing raids over Germany, or rather stressed and lucky to be alive. And the captain would say, raise the flaps. The co-pilot would reach down. What he thought was the flap lever was actually the landing gear, raised it because they were identical and very close to each other on the cockpit. When they raised that, the gear would collapse. And it was like, So they took a little while for them to realize that this wasn't a training issue. This was a system design issue. I'll talk about evidence, in the healthcare environment. This is one of the first studies that they looked at in terms of reducing infections using a checklist. And this was putting catheters in, central line catheters. And they recognized that certain people didn't have any post-operative infections. And they're trying to work out what it was. So they watched them, observed them, and then codified their activity. And then what they did over the next 3 months, they basically ran a trial, and they didn't have any infections at all. And they're sitting there going, okay, this works. And then you've got the one which Atul Gawande led, and Simon Mitchell was involved in from the New Zealand hospitals, those who know him, of looking at safe surgical checklists, looking at mortality and morbidity and complications that are there. And they, depending on how you look at it in terms of numbers or relative bits, nearly halving the death rates from complications because they'd followed checklists. But importantly, it wasn't just the checklist. It was the social environment in which the checklist was used, and the empowerment to the nurses to say, stop, we are not continuing until the checklist is done. So one of the problems they've had is trying to replicate some of these research projects, because they just give the tool out, but they don't create the operating environment, which is something I'll touch on in a minute. And in aviation, we're talking about, potentially the most dangerous phase of flight is coming into land. You've got to touch down at some point. You've got to configure the aircraft. And what they found is that 45% of fatal approach and landing accidents and 70% of all approach and landing accidents in total were due to omitted or incorrectly performed procedures while they were coming in, which is why aviation takes checklists so seriously, because they recognize that people are fallible, and that's a fundamental bit. So we look at comparing aviation to diving. You've got a number of different sort of categories that I'm going to talk about. Normal operations, how to operate the aircraft. That's normal operations. And you've got start, taxi, pre-takeoffs, after takeoffs, configuring the aircraft for normal use. And those are standard or known configurations that you're going to operate the aircraft. You then have abnormal operations, and that's basically where things don't go right. You've got an engine fire, you've got a hydraulic failure, whatever they are. So you deal with those in terms of an emergency. If it's a critical emergency, there are things called boldface items. Those are things that are done from memory, and then a written checklist or an electronic checklist on the displays is used to confirm the actions. So they don't, you know, when the engine's on fire, they don't pull it out and go, right, this is the step you do. It's done from memory, and then they will confirm. And they're using the teamwork, the crew resource management, that you will have pilot flying and pilot monitoring. And so you will have them working together, executing the drill and reading the drill. How they've developed those checklists is you start off with the manufacturer and the engineer and the test pilots from the manufacturer saying, this is how it should be used. And then they will trial it and provide feedback. And then it goes out to the airlines, and then they will operate it. And they might say, you know what, this doesn't quite work because of the way that we operate the aircraft. So they're using feedback mechanisms, using instant reporting, investigations, and a human factors approach, recognizing human fallibility. So we look at diving and, you know, how we go about setting our equipment up ready to go diving. Well, normally we're at home. We might set stuff up, build it, and then stick it in the back of the car, drive to the dive site, load it on the boat, and off you go. Or it might be that you take it in its bits to the dive site and you assemble it and then go diving. So we've got a sort of a gray area where you've got construction or assembly of the dive equipment. Then you have the checks to make sure it sustains life. For a rebreather, that would be on-site checks. For open circuit, with making sure that the gas flows. You turn the valves on and they work. Then you've got post-dive. You know, do you have a checklist for that to take the equipment apart and make sure that you capture everything? I wrote down potentially known configurations because if you look in the manuals for a bunch of dive equipment, it assumes that you start with a box of bits and you put it together for every dive. But that's not how people dive for real. Abnormal moments, we've got oh shit moments. That's where it might be free-flowing regulator, it might be an inflator hose detaches, it might be a solenoid sticks open. Those are all things that you have to do from memory because you don't really have a checklist that's there and you couldn't really access it. So it's the same as the bold face items that the pilots have to do. And it could be that you've got to gas share some things. So there isn't really a possibility to use a checklist. Now, I've been involved in looking at a couple of military rebreathers, and they're actually building those emergency follow-on items into the handsets to say, have you done this? Have you done that? So to make sure that you close the emergency drill down. Teamwork can help here because actually if you're executing a drill, you've now got another pair of eyes or two pairs of eyes looking on to make sure that you execute your drill correctly and maybe stop you if you're doing something wrong. How do we develop and feedback those? Instant reporting. My personal view is most of those are they didn't follow the checklist or they didn't have a checklist with them. It doesn't look at was the checklist actually fit for purpose and provide the information needed for the diver. And there certainly isn't a human factors approach taken to a lot of how this stuff is done, which goes back to the liability process. So the types of checklists that we're talking about, read and do. So this is, as it's sort of described as a recipe. Well, there we go. You read the whole thing, a recipe, find out what you're supposed to do, and then you read each line item and execute the action. Now, the downside of this is it's slower to execute. So we go back to system 1 and 2. We want to go quickly. We have a natural tendency to go quickly. Reading and doing slows us down and maybe slows us down too much. Another way of doing it is challenge, verify, and respond, or challenge and respond as it's also known, or do and confirm. So what you do here is you do a bunch of stuff from memory, and then you go through either as a team and you cross-check each other, or you go through and you use something called point, touch, verbalize, which I'll come on to in a minute, to make sure that the configuration is as is written down. And the checklist will have the parameters on it so you can confirm the selection is correct. It's much faster because you can do that stuff from memory, but there is a potential for missing something out if you're not following the checklist properly. What I would say is, do not mix read and do and challenge, verify, and respond, because you will miss something out, because there's an assumption that something has happened. Assumptions are normal. They make the world go round, unless you're in a critical place where you can't afford to make an assumption. And then the last set are aide-memoirs or SOPs. These are long and detailed, and this is what you see as a lot of checklists out there. They're not proper checklists. They're a way of actually listing steps, detailed steps. They are useful for complicated tasks, and I'll cover competence in a minute. The difficulty is got friction. People don't like using them because they skim read, and it takes a real strong mindset to follow this process down. But if you recognize that you're fallible and you haven't dived for a while, and I guess there's a lot of people on here that haven't dived for a while and they're going to be getting back in, they will be going through the full SOP aide-memoir rather than the shortened checks that they may have done in the past. And then I'll move on to a verbal prompt. And this really isn't a checklist. It's something that allows you to trigger memories and actions that need to be done. The problem is, in this quote here from a research paper 4 years ago, memorized checklists are no real better than no checklist at all, unless you're in a team environment where you're happy to hold each other accountable and make sure that the drills get done. You've got a standard set of prompts within your team, and you know what's coming up next, and you know what should be done. And if you don't get done, if you don't do it, you get called out. So that's really where verbal checklists or verbal prompts are powerful. When it's yourself, you're fallible and you will forget something, and hoping that it's not a critical step that you miss out. Now, what do we need to help checklists be effective? Placeholders. If you're going to have a written checklist or something that is there in front and you're going to move, you can either mark it off with a tag, put a pencil mark or a pen or China graph or whatever it is, mark the step so that you know where you are. Because when you get distracted, and you will get distracted, it tells you where you are. Now, that again requires mental energy to put that process in place. Point, touch, verbalize, or pointing and calling is another term. Japanese train drivers, you can Google Japanese train driver pointing and calling, or Shisakanko. It looks odd, but it works. And they've reduced fatalities by something like 30% off fatal accidents by about 30%. And errors, they caught something like 80% of the errors that are there, because people actually point, touch what it is, and they speak out loud. In the context of diving, it could be my PO2 is, or my set point is 0.7. I have whatever they are on the cells. Or you look at the SPG and say, I have 210 bar. By reading it out, you embed it in your brain more than just going, yeah, okay, what did it say? I don't know, because that's our brains, the way they work. And the final bit is having a sterile environment. When you're going to be in a critical situation, try not to have distractions around you. And that's, you can brief, if you're preparing your rebreather, or you're preparing your camera gear, your video gear, your scooter, something that's critical, just say to people, they're coming over to you, just stop, I'm putting this together. And if you've got a good team, they'll go, oh yeah, sorry. Even better as a team, you look over and you go, they're busy preparing that, I won't disturb them. If you're an instructor, let your team know, your students, I'm just going to build my kit, leave me to it, I'll be over if you need me. Now, if I've got a real problem, yes, wake me up and get me over. But make sure that we create that distraction-free or limited distraction zones so that we limit the likelihood that we end up with a problem. And then the final bit then that goes into making checklists work is technical competence in the skills that we're talking about. Now, I just put this one on a big screen on its own for a very good reason, because checklists are often seen as this panacea, this solution. There we go, use a checklist, use a checklist, use a checklist. But if we don't have a number of elements that are coming up in the next bits of the slides, then actually they won't work. They are just a tool that needs to take into account the social environment, the cultural environment. The checklists need to be designed well to work in the operational environment that we're talking about. So I'm going to play a quick clip here. It's about 50 seconds or so. This is face to camera with the dive team that were there, and one of the guys talking about the morning of the dive when they got on board and Brian was getting himself ready. He was wearing a dry suit, it was quite warm weather, and they were just about to, or they'd just left the quayside.
On the way out to the dive site, it's a short trip, maybe 8 minutes, something like that. He was doing the pre-breathe on his unit, and I think I did mine before we left. I don't remember exactly when I did it now, but I remember seeing him do it, and I remember like checklists and like procedures for doing preparing his gear was like something that was almost like religious to him. It wasn't atypical for me to see him do it. I mean, it was never something that we explicitly talked about. Like, did you do your checklist? Like, I'd see him do it. I knew he was doing it. And if he was doing part of it, I knew that had to have meant he did all of it.
And unfortunately, 2 weeks beforehand, Brian had the same issue about not executing the checklist properly. The unit switched itself off, but fortunately 2 weeks prior, his oxygen cylinder was still on. So he'd made the same mistake and he'd failed safely because his oxygen was turned on. On this particular day, he turned his oxygen off because his instructor had told him that he should turn it off in case the O2 leaks, and the unit he was diving wasn't a manual or a leaky valve CCR. So his oxygen shouldn't have been turned off. So this bit of, well, he's done his checklist, I've seen him do part of it, that means that I know he's done all of it. And he hadn't, unfortunately. So we jump to these conclusions, we make these assumptions all the time based on pattern matching. And this definitely wasn't a team operating together in terms of running a dive training course.
On the way out to the dive site.
So competence, and what I'm going to say here, the quality control of training. As a graduate from a course, you're only given, or you will probably only know the information you've been given during the course. And this is one of the difficulties as a graduate or a student, you don't know what you don't know. And you're relying on the instructor to give you the information that you need to successfully dive after the course. So the knowledge part of competence is you do know what you should know. And that doesn't mean you know everything, but it means that you know what you should do for the tasks that are coming up. Skills is you physically execute the task as you should, when you should. So these are motor skills, there's cognitive thought processes, they're all linked together and they require practice, they require perfect practice. And that means having some form of feedback and continually improving. And then we have attitude. And that's you have the mindset that failure is always possible and you plan to fail safely as a consequence. That's what checklists are about. They recognize, or they're in place because there is a recognition that you are fallible and you will make a mistake at some point. So what we're trying to do is trap those errors through checklists so that they don't propagate and we don't end up with a critical step being missed. So we're looking at the operational environment, and I know that Chauncey's on here and wrote a brilliant piece or a number of years ago on Scuba Board that talks all about this. So I'm going to touch it in about 2 or 3 minutes. If you want to go and look more, and I'm sure Chauncey will post his link in there at some point, go and read those blogs, really good stuff. So look at the environment in which you're going to operate. Is it time constrained? What's the weather like? I've seen a couple of organizations go, right, here we go. Here's a pre-breathe checklist for your phone that you can use out on the dive boat. Really? Somebody's going to put a grand's worth of phone in their hand while they're doing the pre-breathe on the dive boat? It's not going to happen. Or if it does, there's just too much risk of trashing the phone. And so make sure that it is easily accessible, it's waterproof, and it's small. Coupling and resilience. And what this is about is the time available to do a task versus the time available to do the checklist. And even in open circuit, if you're going to do your pre-dive checks, if the skipper says, right, got 10 minutes to go till we jump in, he's like, well, that's not enough. And we end up rushing. Is you go back to the skipper and say, look, next time it takes me, a good 10 minutes to get my stuff ready. Can you give us a 20-minute warning or a 30-minute, whatever it is, so that you can start prepping that? Because otherwise you will start rushing your checks and you won't wait for the right things to happen. And it might be that the pre-breathe that you're doing, so one of the failure points on the rebreather for Brian was that he'd done a pre-breathe before they left or on the way out to the dive site. He then left the unit and the battery turned itself off, which is programmed to do, and it reset the dive conditions. Now, that wasn't picked up by Brian beforehand. So understanding the operational environment, the times involved, the constraints and everything else like that is important when we're putting the design of the checklist together. Flow and rituals. This is about getting into a real habit. And I have a ritual that when I step up, even though I've done a full GUE Edge with my team, when I are about to step up from a bench on a boat, I will go dry suit in, wing in, reg, breathable, and that might be a travel mix if I've got hypoxic trimix. But now I've got buoyancy, and I've got a breathable source of gas that if it all goes horribly wrong on the surface, I can sort it out. And that's my ritual. And that's happened because I've learned things have gone wrong before I'd done GUE Edge properly. So getting a ritual is more powerful than a habit. And you want to, so going back one, actually, flow, if you could design your checklist, think about how you gear up or get yourself ready for the dive. And it might be that you have to tweak a checklist a couple of times because you find that there's something is out of sequence. And I'll bring one of the points up on a checklist in about 3 or 4 slides time it says, hold the handset and then start manipulating other things. Well, hang on a minute, I can't hold the handset and do the other things. So think about the flow of actions in there that need to happen. And the relevance. Is there something that is on the checklist that's not relevant? And I'll show an example on a checklist in a minute. So what makes an effective checklist? Importantly, it's there to support the user's behavior. The whole key part of human factors is making it easy to do the right thing, making it hard to do the wrong thing. If you design a checklist that has friction, that is difficult to use for a whole bunch of reasons, people won't use it. Now, there are trade-offs with this because what you would like to do, and I'll come on to in a minute, is actually have a standardized checklist so that you can then cross-check each other within a team, assuming you're diving in a team environment. It's environmentally and timely relevant to the flow. So I was talking about that coupling and making sure that things happen at the right stage for the task at hand. Again, we go back to the bit above. There are known entry and exit points and configurations. This goes back to chunking it. So when you leave one checklist, it's a standard configuration that you enter in the next checklist. And this is one of the problems I see with rebreather checklists where or they're not checklists, they're aid memoirs, it's making an assumption that you start with a box of bits as opposed to a half assembled unit, and then you're moving on. And it might be that you change things. So your checklist needs to take into account the configuration you're going to use it. Keep it brief. 5 to 8 items, 5 to 8 words per line. That's it. The idea is that you can look at it and scan. You don't have to read every word that's in there. If you can get them shorter, that's great. But what this requires then is competence and skill to operate the equipment, because these should be mental prompts for the actions that you are trained and training to do. Going back up about configurations is, if you have a standardized checklist, that means that I can look across the boat at B and we're using the same checklist, and I know what she's going to do next, and she knows what I'm going to do next, or we're working together. And if I miss a step, she can go, hey, Gareth, aren't we supposed to be doing that? Oh, yeah, sorry. So we can hold each other accountable to what's going on. This works really well in verbal prompts rather than checklists. And I saw a comment about the sort of mnemonics. For me, as an individual diver, they are fallible. As a team that can hold each other accountable, they work, or can work. Actions with verifiable system responses. And by that, I mean, when you say SPGs, what are you expecting? Or if you say check PO2, what are you expecting? Because it's the response you should be looking for, not, yeah, SPGs there, or the PO2 or the MAV or whatever it is. What we're looking for is, when the gear goes down on an aircraft, it's not moving the lever that the checklist is associated with. It's the lights that come on to say the gear is down and it's locked. And then you ensure that you have the correct mode of operation. So you do either read and do or challenge and response. Don't do both, because you will get mixed up and you will miss something. And the problem is that if you may not even actually have a negative outcome, and you think, oh, that's okay, I can do that the next time. We've got that outcome bias. So I am biased. I am going to show these here as the rebreather checklists for GUE, as probably the ones that I've seen as the most effective. Now, if there's ways of pulling those apart, feel free. I am part of the sort of GUE standards and quality control thing. So on the left-hand side, and these are all stickers. So this pre-dive checklist, the advanced preparation checklist, is done so that you stick it to a cylinder and it's treated almost like an analysis tape. And this is about co-checking. It's not about holding you to account when things go wrong, but it's the same as having a gas analysis tape that I can look across and say, you've done your check. Now, you could lie, you could make these numbers up, that's fine. But if I find out that you've lied on your checklists, we ain't diving again. And that's what teamwork's about in terms of the trust. So you prepare the checklist, then you get on the site, and then you do a final set of checks. We're looking at volumes, analysis, all of these things, make sure that they work. And then there is a final 5-minute pre-breathe check, which is about configuring the system, or checking that the system is actually working, that the set point goes from 0.7, or you move the set point from 0.7 to 1 to 0.7, and it responds as it should do. The head-up display responds as it should do in terms of the controller. That you can flow check the ADV, you flush, check the PO2 changes. And the same thing with the oxygen, and you drive the PO2 high and hold it up there. And then there's just a systems check. This can be put in a similar way to Michael's checklist that he's got here on the side of the little petrol controller, Shearwater controller. Now, something I was thinking about here is Shearwater missed a trick here, because the battery compartment is on the wrong side of the handset, which means that the checklist is on the wrong side of the handset when you hold it like this, because it's actually on the far side. So that would be, some comments. I know Michael's on here. Is these are great prompts, but I wouldn't say that they were useful in terms of what are they supposed to give me. other than potentially operations to make sure that they are there. But they don't give you the responses. So that would be my comment about these is they're great, get people thinking about them, but what are we looking for in terms of a response? This bit about extra information that you don't need. WISE, always know your PO2, verify your PO2, all of these bits here, this is not part of a pre-dive check. This is basically saying, I told you to check your PO2. If you didn't, it's your fault. My cynical view. These appeared on the Human Factors in Diving Facebook group. It's great that they're getting out there, but it's making sure that they are usable, that these are a good size. These can go into wet notes or a pocket or something like that. That's great. This is a crop from a much bigger picture where actually these are aid memoirs. And again, for these, I would say, wing operation, that's fine, dry suit operation. When we talk about some of the other bits, making sure that there are responses or values rather than just generic statements that are there. And this one here was put together almost as it was a supervisor's checklist, and it's working with NIWA in New Zealand. And they took some work that I did with Valerie and Crispin, created these checklists, and they originally started them off as challenge and response. But what they were doing, they moved them more to read and do to make sure that they were getting done, because they found that when they did challenge and response, things were getting missed and they were having to back up. And this is, a different way of running a checklist. You have a supervisor who's reading the messages out and the diver is executing. That isn't what happens in the majority of diving that's there. Now, this came from a paper by Degani talking about using or designing normal checklists. And this I bolded and colored is make sure the response to your checklist is relevant. It's the same as saying, are you okay? Yeah, I'm okay. Well, what does that mean? Or it could be, we're going up and the response is okay. Is that, I understood that, or I'm just acknowledging you, or what? If we're going to be in critical situations, you want to respond with a number. Gas checked? Yes, checked. It's 210 bar and 32%. Okay, that's the response I want, not checked. Because then I know that you're likely to have done something about it. Again, you could make those numbers up. Now, I've given aviation and healthcare as good examples, but there are still problems with those. I've got to move my bits to read this quote here. So the first one about surgical safety checklists is, yes, they can make a difference, but they have to have leadership, teamwork, work design around safe operations. It's not about giving somebody a checklist and expecting it to work, which is why I was saying that checklists are part of a wider system. And then another piece here, which from Ken Catchpole, a checklist reliant on teamwork for success may fail despite all the items being followed because those team skills were insufficient. So that's about communication, leadership, creating a shared mental model, which is what I'm talking about in a lot of the aviation side, or sorry, when I'm trying to bring in crew resource management and non-technical skills. Aviation, you'd think would be ultra safe. No, there are still issues with this. And if you go and look at this article here, it talks about some work that was done by the NTSB, sorry, the National Business Aviation Association, NBAA, looking at live business jet operations. And this 18% was made up of 2% who never did control checks in the survey they did, and 16% did partial control checks. And in this particular occasion, business jet got some VIPs on board. They were rushing, they didn't do flying control checks to make sure that there was full and free movement. And unfortunately, there were flight controls in place and they couldn't get airborne. They were running down the runway, they got to the takeoff speed and went, this isn't working. And they couldn't stop in time, ran off the end of the runway into the gully, and all 7 people were killed. Now, this is a quote from the report. So 98% of their previous 175 takeoffs, they didn't do complete flight control checks. And this was a bit of a shock. And then they started looking at other airlines or operators and going, we need to jump up. And actually what they realized is that this was a lack of safety leadership, that operators were accepting these deviations because it was acceptable. And they hadn't crashed aircraft, therefore it must have been okay. The absence of accidents doesn't mean that you're actually safe. So when do checklists not work? Well, we've talked about designing them. So they're not designed for the user or the environment. What's the task? What's their competency? How are they going to use it? They're too long or complicated. We are fast processing people. We want to get through things quickly. And if we're given 4 or 5 pages to do something, unless we've got a really strong mindset to follow that step by step, it'll just get missed. And each time we miss it and it goes okay, it gets worse because we reinforce the bad behaviors. A number of times those checklists are not checklists, they're SOPs or aid memoirs. They're detailed documents that allow you to go through a process. They are not there as mental checks against your competencies that you've already developed. The flow is wrong. They don't work how you're supposed to. And peer pressure is incredibly important in a recreational activity. The last time I was on a liveaboard, I was the only person. There were 4 rebreather divers on the boat. I was the only diver using a written checklist for my pre-breathe and make sure everything was okay. I did a face-to-face check on the dive deck with my buddy and made sure that the critical elements were in place. 2 other divers on that boat didn't do any. And they got to the stage at the end of the week where they weren't doing any pre-breathe. And I know both of them on at least one occasion each had to turn their cylinders on as they descended the shot line because they'd forgotten to do it. Now, that didn't end up as a disaster, but it so could have done. Now, I'll play a quick, well, it's 45 seconds video to show how powerful social conformance can be.
Now, here's a fella with his hat on in the elevator. First, he makes a full turn to the rear, and Charlie closes the door. A moment later, we'll open the door. Everybody's changed positions. Now we'll see if we can use group pressure for some good. Now, in a moment, on Charlie's signal, everybody turns forward. Notice they take off their hats. And now, do you think we could reverse the procedure? Watch.
Social conformance is incredibly powerful. And if you're in a leadership or an influential position, what you do, others will copy. So if you're not doing checks, others will look on and go, oh, they're good. They're a hero. I can do what they do. And I will follow them. We are social creatures. And the irony is, it's much harder to do the right thing when everybody is doing the wrong thing. So we go back to that routine violation piece. If I do the right thing, like doing those checklists, it was uncomfortable for me to use the written checklists because I was the only one doing it. And I was getting grief from the others. And I'm like, well, I won't say what I was saying because I know that I'm fallible. And the idea of the checklist is to keep me honest and stop me or track the errors that are there. On the sign in, the web page that you signed in to get the link for this, if you scroll down, there's a bunch of additional research papers and one which I sort of touched on earlier, co-wrote for the AAUS, American Academy of Underwater Sciences, looking at checklists. And there's a summary of the research and then the checklist process that they put together. And I said in the thing that I will go through the list, randomly pick somebody and post you or contact you for your postal address, and I'll send you a copy of the checklist manifesto. This is the sort of an easy read Bible of how to put checklists and the culture that's associated with it. But it boils down to, I'm fallible, I make mistakes. How do I trap those before they become critical? Those who've done training with me, especially in the face-to-face courses, realize that the training tools that I use are designed to force you to use checklists well, and not just the badly written checklists that are in the book, and they're there for a reason, but the teamwork that's associated there to create a shared mental model within the team. So there's a number of different aspects of training that I deliver. There's the book if you haven't got it. Go and watch If Only, Human Diver / If Only. It's 35 minutes. There's a workbook you can go through to learn more about stuff that's there. And you will see the criticality of running checklists individually and as a team. And it just creates a much safer environment. And there's a whole bunch of blogs on the Human Diver site too. So the final thing is a parting thought. We all make mistakes, and that includes using checklists. So when you hear about, oh, they had a checklist, it didn't work, therefore checklists are crap, understand why the checklist didn't get executed properly. Now, it might be a poor checklist design. It might be there were distractions. There might be a whole bunch of other things that were there. But don't immediately jump to the conclusion that says checklists are rubbish, they don't work, they take time up, and we can't afford to do that. It's not the case. There are very few occasions in diving where you don't have the time to run through a structured check, either written as an individual or as a team, verbally cross-checking each other and holding each other to account. There are very few occasions when that happens. And if it does, think about what caused that, because it'll be an environmental situation that you can probably control. And the final bit, which is what I write in all the books that I sign and send out, is a quote from J.W. Goethe. Knowledge is not enough, we must apply. Willing is not enough, we must do. So I'm hoping that you've gained a bunch of knowledge, and I'm going to extend the questions until 1:45, because I know we've run a bit, 1:15, run a bit long than that. So on that note, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'll see how many questions Guy and Bart have picked up as we went through. So Guy, Bart, over to you two.
There was a question at 10:49 from Marie-Josée Limoges. Can you expand on the difference between a mistake and an unintentional violation?
Yeah, it's a good one. It's one that comes up often, and the difference is the presence of rules. It's as simple as that. So a mistake could be, I park in the wrong slot in a car park. That would be a mistake. Now, if it's a disabled driving slot and it's got a time associated with it, that would be an unintended violation. So and one of the problems we have in diving is there are very few rules per se. So can you have a violation if you don't have a structured rule? So the difference between, well, it's the presence of rules. So hopefully that answered that one.
There was another question from Rendra. In recreational rebreather training, most agencies will use an agency-created checklist in the course. In that checklist, there's also a note that the diver is to refer to equipment checklist as issued by manufacturer. In this case, which checklist should be treated as the primary checklist?
So I'll go back to the bit that was red at the bottom that says not for liability, organizational liability. So the reference back to manufacturer's checklist is a liability piece. Now, the way it works in aviation is the manufacturer will create the operational checklist, and then they will give it to the airline, who will then modify it. But the manufacturer has to agree to that. And in certain regulations, the FAA or EASA or the regulator has to agree that the checklist is fit for purpose. We don't have that structure within diving. So there is no right answer, because the agency is saying, here's how we should be teaching you. But then they're saying, use the manufacturer's bit. Well, in that case, why isn't the agency's checklist mirrored to the manufacturer's checklist? And I've got a research project planned to actually come up with a standardized pre-jump checklist in the same way that the World Health Organization surgical safety checklist is put together. Because actually, if we can do that final piece, which should be standard, and that's what the research will be about, is can we develop a standardized pre-dive final rebreather check across all the agencies? And I'm sure there's going to be some resistance because, no, this is how we do it. But hey ho. Next. Oh, is that it? There are only 2 questions.
Yep, that's what stood out to us.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah, go for it.
Thanks. I've heard you speak on several occasions, and we've spoken face to face with a few times. The one additional thing that I've taken out of this seminar that really hit home to me is practice what you preach. And I went through all the other stuff you've gone through. Yes, I understand all of that. When it comes to being an instructor, that puts a whole new slant on the issue, because you're not just dealing with your own safety. And I think I have yet. I mean, I've been through, over the years I've been diving, I've had about 4 different rebreathing instructors. All of them were very, very good rebreathing instructors, which is why I'm still alive. And why I'm now an instructor myself. But none of them have implicitly said to me and shown me that they use a checklist every time they go over the dive. None of them have actually pointed out to me while I've been training with them, whether it's been training as a diver or as a dive instructor, this is how we do it because this is a checklist. And by the way, don't feel frightened that you have to make up your own checklist because you might be dealing with a different bit of kit that I'm dealing with. They've never said that. That's what I'm going to take away from tonight.
And so there's a point that I know I was running a bit late, so I missed out one of the slides, which was actually organizational influence. And the difference between if an instructor stands at the front of the class and says, I have to teach you checklists because it's in the core standards, versus I want to teach you checklists because they've saved my life, words matter big time. And there is a definite need to get across to say, look, so even just talking about it, and then there's the role modeling, that's because students will look on at you and go, oh, they haven't used a checklist, so they don't value it. And I know from my own Mod 1, getting some grief from, what are you using the written checklist for? Because that's my background and I know I'm fallible and I will use this, even if it takes me another 2 minutes. Whoopee. Is 2 minutes that critical? Well, if it is, I should have started 2 minutes earlier and I'll know the next time. But yeah, role modeling is so powerful, Tony.
There is another question from Phil. Should pre-dive checklists be integrated into dive computers for both CCR and Open Circuit?
So that was also on the slide that I missed out, which is great because we can cover it here. There is I think on a CCR, it can be done and is being done, and B might correct me, for the Red Bear, there's the built-in checklist, and because they've got high pressure sensors, you can actually see whether or not stuff is being done, like open the valves, because it will then sense the high pressure. I don't see any reason why they shouldn't be done, and I think this is part of the thing of having a standardized check for, say, the final pre-jump. Then you could do something. You would have to agree what that looked like, but I know that from an agency point of view, everybody likes to have their own little nuances because that's their sales thing, and this is how we do it here. We can't have the same check as somebody else does. But if we got rid of all of that, there's no reason why we couldn't do those sorts of things. It might end up being a tick box exercise, but if it adds as a little bit of a prompt to stop things, then stop things going wrong, that'd be great. You also need to have reliable hardware. So after Rebreather Forum 3, which was in 2012, I think it was, Mark will correct me on that, there was a piece about, we then went to Eurotech, gave a panel discussion, And at that time, the Sentinel wasn't particularly reliable. And it was having sort of pre-dive checks, and it was throwing wobbles, and people were fed up with not being able to go diving because their checklist couldn't be executed. And I asked the question, is it the electronic checklist you don't like, or is it the unreliability of the electronic rebreather that you don't like? Because those are two different arguments that need to be addressed. And I never got a response, but I think it's because people were fed up with the unreliability of it. And you go, well, I'll just jump in, because the last time I jumped in and it gave me alerts, it was okay. Therefore, this time it is too. This is, you know, human nature to do so. Hopefully that answered for you, Phil.
Gareth, there was
Yeah.
another, not so much a question as well, actually a good suggestion from Adrian. I suspect a lot of people here are diving at the more risky end of diving. Should we also be introducing checklists far earlier in recreational diving to get the culture changing?
Yes. It's the simple answer. The potential reason that doesn't happen from my perspective is diving at the recreational level is marketed as really safe and accessible to everybody. And which also goes to Tony's point about role modeling. You can start that straight away easily by instructors doing proper, I'm going to say, verbal checks before they go diving. The number of instructors or guides or dive masters who may do it themselves, but then they don't get observed by their students, their clients or whatever, doing the check. So they just look and go, oh, cool. When you get to be a dive master, you don't have to do these faffy checklists. You can just go off and go diving, and it's all great. So there is a huge culture shift that starts with, we make mistakes, and we shouldn't berate and criticize people for being human and being fallible. That's the, which then goes into the just culture piece and learning from errors and everything else like that. So thanks, Bart.
And Eric had another question as well. Are there statistics available about accident causes and then caused by medical issues followed from not following checklist or from following them? So basically, is there any proof?
Who's the person who said that? Because they can unmute themselves and speak up.
Erik de Groef.
Okay, are you able to unmute yourself and explain that one a little bit more? Ooh, where are you?
I guess Eric is not here.
Yes, I'm here, but I didn't find the unmute button.
Oh, okay, no worries.
So I'm not so good in English, so I was thinking about.
Okay, so I think what you're saying is, can we, in the accident data, the fatality data that's there, are we able to identify whether it's medical issues, equipment issues, human factors issues, and would a checklist have trapped those issues before they become serious incidents?
Yes, because some things you cannot avoid, I think. So like underlying medical problems, even when you follow a checklist, you won't
agreed. Yeah.
Get them out of the risk zone.
So agreed on that, and that then comes down to sort of personal responsibility about fitness. And again, we go back to the outcome bias. You might be hugely overweight, really unfit. You go diving, you get out, and you're fine. And you have no idea how much stress you put under your body, and your metric of safety is, I'm still alive. That's okay. And when you start to talk about overweight, unfit divers, it gets incredibly emotional very quickly, and people go, diving should be for everybody. It's like, yeah, okay, I get that. At the same time, if you are, I'm going to make up numbers, if you've got I know BMI is a rubbish way of measuring it, but if you've got a BMI of 35, 40, 45, you're going to be carrying a lot of risk But when that risk materializes, somebody's going to have to get you back on the boat or get you back on shore. And so often people don't think about that side of the piece. And I don't think Valerie's on the call. We've got a presentation coming up later on the year talking about both sides of the risk thing. So in terms of the data, generally the data is rubbish in terms of trying to find causes. There is some papers published about violations and why, and the violations that did happen, but we don't understand why those violations happened, the local rationality. And that's some work that I'm going to be doing with Dan, is actually how do we modify and adapt the current incident reporting system to capture more of this.
And can't you just adapt the checklist individually in those cases?
I'm not sure. Well, I don't know what you'd actually ask for. That's the problem. In terms of a checklist, you know, it would be, well,
of course, if you know you are a bit heavier, should you not adapt some, but like having dive computers, putting them a bit heavier?
So it's such an inaccurate thing. And Frauke, were you waving to speak?
Yes, please, if I could.
Go for it.
Okay. So the fatality collection or surveillance that we do at Dan, and we probably underreport, but we have a ton of information we collect, including a question: was the gas checked, or did you have a check, or did that person have a checklist? I can say now from the data we have that this is filled out in maybe 2 to 5% of cases, because it's just not known. And then even if we know that the checklist was in place, and even if then someone says, yeah, he definitely followed it, we usually don't have access to that checklist and could say, yeah, this was clever, or this was not, or this was appropriate for what it was meant to be. Mm-hmm. So a lot of things that is just not reported or is not there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Phil's question here is, do you feel comfortable to do this dive? And I would ask the response to that would be, if you don't, then, and you're going to dive, you'd probably tick yes. It's understanding the cognitive biases, and the closer you come to the dive. So you may have invested $150 in the boat. You've taken a day off work. The kit isn't quite working, but you haven't dived for ages. And I wrote a blog about it's really difficult to thumb a dive. The closer you get to jumping off the boat, the harder it is to say no, because of something called the sunk cost fallacy. The more you sink into something, the harder it is to say no. So we have to take those. So whilst you could put a question like that on a checklist, I don't think it adds any value to the safety of the activity. And it probably from my perspective, would come across as a liability transfer exercise rather than a safety process, because that to me is something that should be done at any time. If I don't feel comfortable, I don't have to get in.
Eduardo had another one. Eduardo asked, what about the fact that GUE uses a CCR configuration that is not standard and not even certified?
So,
over to you.
So there we go. Well, I can pass that over to another GUE instructor on here. So as I understand it, it is going through CE. Now, in terms of the CE process, there is lots of stuff. So I'm going to basically talk about generally. CE provides a good baseline. It allows you to test a unit under certain configurations and ensure that it meets certain standards. As I understand it, and I don't know enough, which is why I'm going to sort of caveat it, is the bits that you would test on a CE standard for a GUE configuration would be the same as you would test for a standard configuration. The fact that paperwork isn't there is the sticking point. And in fact, I've got 2 GUE instructors on here, but I won't put them in there. It is an interesting point. Just because something is CE, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is inverted commas safe for the configuration that's there. It just means it meets some standards. And I know the same sort of presentations I'm talking about with Valerie and Risk, that are going to have a presentation that looks about human factors in CE, because that is missing. There is nothing in there that talks about the human factor side. There we go. Oh, I can see what the discussion points are going on there. So Eduardo, I'm sorry, I don't know enough detail to answer it, but I can put you in contact with 2. I've got the emails for the 3 of you, and we'll basically exchange afterwards. Michael, what measures would you take to implement a culture using checklists in a non-global environment? For example, a dive club with like a few hundred people. Role model. From that point of view, any club is going to have some leadership in there. And those leaders need to role model using checklists. They need to talk about their fallibility. They need to talk about where they have trapped errors using checklists. And they talk about that sort of stuff, and they show the value. And then to try and increase that is understand what the barriers to people adopting them are. And, you know, I've covered a bunch of them already. Most of them are flawed in terms of concerns. Oh, I can't use a checklist because blah, 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 blah. Okay, why? Because I don't have enough time, or I can't, you know, I don't have it where I'm kitting up. Okay, well, they're all practical reasons that can be got around. So start off with role modeling.
Phil had an interesting one as well. Should there be a place on a checklist for a non-technical check, such as, do you feel comfortable to do this dive?
Yeah, I'd already covered that one, which is where we got into Frauke's peak. So there we go. Right, next, there we go. So Eduardo, yeah, sure. Speak, unmute yourself and speak.
Oh, hello, can you hear me?
Yep, all good.
How are you, Garrett?
All good, thanks, Eduardo.
Sorry, I have nothing against GUE. I appreciate very much what they're doing. I always feel a bit after you have people that have been working with the problem related to it, we redesign the wheel. For example, you know, the GUE configuration on the CCR is based on having the bailout attached to the unit, and which is something that actually gives me a lot of question marks, you know, because the nice thing of the attached by the side is that you can easily deploy it, handle it, move it. If you have to penetrate, you know, it makes your configuration much easier to use. And also, I know that on different units, on different agencies, the oxygen will be always placed in a specific area, the valve is placed in a specific area, the diluent as well, you know. So I think that we can have different photocopies, but the paper that we put in the photocopy, if it's A4, makes it easy for everyone. That's only my idea, sorry. Okay, no, that's cool. So rather than derail this one, I'm happy to pick up a conversation between yourself and the 2 CCR GUE CCR instructors on here, and we can get a call together and sort that out. So Carlos, pre-dive checks, open water based on acronyms. Yes, I think having a standard across all of the agencies would be really beneficial so that people know what needs to be done when. But there is also the bit of, well, this is how we do it, and this is how we do it. And this is, you know, our phrase that we know. And so I can see there being difficulties in that. Thank you. Anything else? Excellent.
Yeah, there was a question from Michael.
Mm-hmm.
Wait a second. what measures would you like to implement in a culture of using checklists in a non-global environment? For example, a dive club with like few 100 people?
Yeah, that would be about the leadership and role modeling, to get that across. And just talk about why checklists. Feel free to lift any of the stuff that I'm going to put in the presentation and use it to talk to your club and explain. Checklists are there to reduce the likelihood of an error propagating through a system, i.e., trap the error, so we don't end up with a critical failure. So if you don't get and that's the reason why I spent a little bit of time at the start talking about human error and how it occurs. If you don't understand human error and how they happen and they propagate through the system, you don't really understand the value of a checklist. What's Tommy said? Is no one doing buddy checks anymore? Would you consider that as a checklist? So that I would consider it a verbal prompt. I wouldn't consider it a checklist, because it's something that you're checking against. Now, a verbal prompt, which is what BWRAF or GUE Edge or ABC, those are verbal prompts. If you're doing those individually from memory, they are fallible. And that was a point, is if you're going to solo dive, use a written checklist and use placeholders, move your thumb down, use a China graph, whatever it is. If you're in a team, you can afford to use verbal prompts, but you have to have created the psychologically safe environment that turn around and went, no, you haven't done that. Oh, okay. And if you've missed it, you expect somebody else to call you out. That's not often present. So to your point, is no one doing buddy checks anymore? It depends where you are and what culture you're in. But if you go places, visit different areas, you'll see that buddy checks don't get done very often. Other places, totally strict team diving, and they'll follow through. So it can be a bit of an eye-opener, unfortunately. When are we going to do Jemison again? I missed that spaceship. So Paul, just as a plug, Daryl and Bart actually are looking at running courses at the end of June in Fujairah and Dubai. So they'll be on the website shortly, and you can go and touch base with Daryl for details. But the rest of those courses, as I say, starting in the UK, I think 19th and 20th of June. And I think Jenny is running a class in Dahab at the end of this month. But the online, the webinar-based class, there's two starting 7th of June, which the last class I just finished got some really good feedback from. There's one starting 8:30 GMT and one starting 18:30 GMT. So they're covering Australia, New Zealand, Middle East and Far East. That's the 8:30 in the morning one. And then the evening slot will cover Europe and States. So the details are on the webinar, on the humandiver.com there. Cool. No, not Jemison. It's lovely, Adrian. Vishwanath, thank you. That it is that response. So if you talk about a checklist or a verbal prompt, it is getting confirmation of the configuration or the response rather than yes, done, check, whatever. It's closing that communication loop to build the mental model that's within the team. Excellent. If there's nothing else, I'm going to sign off, and we'll see you all sometime soon. Thank you very much, everybody. And you'll get an email, and look forward to seeing you all on Zoom or classes or face-to-face and everything else like that. So thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks, Gareth. Many thanks.
What are you doing in Zoom?
Thank you.
That's
Are you in Zoom?
Thank you.
That's right. It was somebody
Cheers, thanks.
And Debbie, before you go, I did forget to post the book, and I'll post it tomorrow. Apologies.
Oh, okay, no problem. Good to see you.
Thanks. Excellent. All right. So we can probably stop the recording now, B. That's awesome.